Rain streaked the courthouse windows as Elijah Brooks stepped through the heavy front doors, his worn leather shoes squeaking faintly on the polished floor. The air inside smelled like old books and coffee, thick with tension and anticipation. Dressed in a modest second-hand suit that barely fit his tall frame, Elijah moved quietly, but with intention. He didn't look like the other lawyers. Older, sharper, more expensive. Still, he walked with purpose, his eyes scanning the room, his lips silently rehearsing arguments he had gone over 100 times. As he signed his name on the appearance register, 2 attorneys from a prestigious firm glanced his way and exchanged smirks. One leaned in and whispered, loud enough for him to hear, "First timer, poor client's already lost." Another adjusted his Rolex and chuckled. Elijah ignored them, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose and steadying his breathing. He wasn't here to impress anyone. He was here to fight for someone who had no one else. The courtroom buzzed with activity. A high-profile landlord-tenant case was on the docket, an eviction that had sparked quiet outrage in the community. The plaintiff, a wealthy landlord known for kicking out low-income tenants during renovations. The defendant, a single mother named Angela Morris, who had filed complaints about mold and broken heat, only to find herself facing eviction weeks later. Elijah had taken her case pro bono when no one else would. Other firms called it a waste of time. Some said she should just cut her losses and move. But Elijah remembered his own mother's struggle with eviction when he was 9. He couldn't walk away from this one. He approached the bench as the case was called, his heart pounding, but his expression calm. Judge Cranston, known for his strict tone and sharp judgments, adjusted his glasses and looked Elijah up and down. "This your first time standing alone, Mr. Brooks?" the judge asked, his voice dry and mildly amused. Elijah straightened his back. "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Cranston gave a thin, knowing smile. "Let's see if inexperience is your only flaw." A few chuckles rose from the plaintiff's side of the room. Elijah didn't flinch. "I came prepared." There was a brief silence before the judge nodded. "We'll see." As he turned back to his seat, Elijah met Angela's eyes. She looked tired, worried, but grateful. She had placed all her hope in him. He gave her a small, steady nod. Inside, he was battling nerves, but he refused to let it show. Everything in his life had led to this moment. Every late night studying, every rejection, every time someone told him he didn't belong. The odds were stacked, but Elijah wasn't afraid. He wasn't here to prove his worth to the courtroom. He was here to defend someone's right to live with dignity, and no title, no suit, no smirk was going to stop him from trying. The night before the hearing, Elijah sat alone in his cramped office, lit only by a flickering desk lamp and the faint glow of streetlights outside. Papers were spread across every surface. Statutes, case files, eviction notices, all carefully highlighted and marked with notes in tight handwriting. A single coffee cup sat cold beside him, forgotten hours ago. His eyes were tired, but focused. He flipped through another page of an old housing code binder, his finger stopping on a section most lawyers skipped entirely. He had found it hours earlier, Section 8203B, a rarely invoked clause known as the tenant retaliation provision. It protected tenants from being evicted simply for reporting code violations. The problem was, no one used it anymore. Judges rarely honoured it, and most landlords laughed at it. But Elijah wasn't most lawyers, and this wasn't just any eviction case. He glanced at the photo pinned to his corkboard. It showed a tired but smiling woman in her late 30s holding a boy in a wheelchair. Angela Morris. She worked 2 jobs, cleaned buildings at night, and delivered food during the day, all while caring for her son, Malik, who was born with muscular dystrophy. Her building had gone weeks without heat during winter, and mold had spread through the corners of her apartment. When she complained to city inspectors, she received an eviction notice a month later. No firm wanted the case. It's not winnable. You'll ruin your name before it starts. She can't even pay. Elijah had heard it all. But when Angela walked into his office, carrying her son's medical records and a stack of unanswered complaint letters, something in him refused to say no. He remembered what it felt like, to be powerless, to watch your family pushed out by people with more money than mercy. He remembered his mother begging for an extension on rent while holding back tears. That memory burned hotter than fear. The door creaked open, and his mentor, Marcus Gray, stepped in. A retired lawyer with decades of experience, he had taken Elijah under his wing during law school and still checked in now and then. He looked at the mess of papers and shook his head. "You really going for that clause?" Marcus asked, walking over. Elijah nodded. "It's all I've got." Marcus frowned. "That's a law no one uses. You'll get laughed out of court." Elijah leaned back, exhaled slowly. "If I don't use it, she loses everything. I'm not fighting to win. I'm fighting to matter." There was a long pause. Marcus studied him, then gave a tired smile. "You always were too stubborn for your own good." Elijah grinned faintly. "You say that like it's a flaw." Marcus patted his shoulder and turned to leave. "Just don't let the system crush that fire. It's rare." Left alone again, Elijah turned back to the clause, tracing the line with his finger. He knew the judge wouldn't take him seriously. He knew the opposing attorneys would mock him. But he also knew this clause was real. It was buried, ignored, forgotten, but real. And in the morning, he would bring it to life. Not for prestige, not for applause, but for a woman the system had left behind, and the boy whose world depended on her. The next morning, the courtroom buzzed with tension as spectators shuffled into their seats and murmurs echoed off the high marble walls. Elijah sat at the defendant's table, organizing his notes one final time, every paper neatly clipped, every citation triple-checked. He wore the same modest suit, pressed carefully the night before, and beside him sat Angela Morris, gripping the handles of her warm purse with white knuckles. Then the doors opened, and in strode Mr. Leonard Bexley, tall, smug, and dressed like someone who owned the building itself. 3 lawyers followed him like shadows, all from the powerful firm Carrington and Hale, their suits tailored, their confidence practiced. They moved with a swagger that said they'd already won. One of them, a younger partner named Deacon, glanced over at Elijah and smirked. "Guess the court's running a charity program now," he muttered to his colleague. "That briefcase looks like it's been through a flood." Another added, "Maybe he got his degree on Google. This'll be quick." Elijah heard them, of course, but he didn't flinch. He simply closed his folder and waited. He wasn't there to trade insults. He was there to win justice. Judge Cranston finally entered the room, robe flowing behind him like a cloak of finality. He gave a cursory nod toward both parties before settling into his high-backed chair. His tone was brisk, his patience clearly worn thin by the court's backlog. "We'll begin," he said flatly, not even sparing Elijah a glance. "Plaintiff, proceed." Bexley's lead attorney stood and launched into a highly polished opening statement. He painted a picture of a tenant who failed to pay, failed to maintain cleanliness, and violated lease terms with noise complaints. The narrative was slick, rehearsed, and dripping with subtle classism. Elijah rose to object when one claim stated Angela intentionally damaged the unit, something Bexley had never alleged until now. "Objection! Misrepresentation of facts," Elijah said firmly. Judge Cranston waved it off before even hearing the full reason. "Overruled. Let him finish." Angela turned to Elijah, her voice a whisper barely above a breath. "We're losing, aren't we?" He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes forward, voice low but sure. "Not yet. I haven't spoken." The courtroom moved on, but the tone was set. Every time Elijah tried to interject, he was shut down. Every eye in the room seemed to roll in sync whenever he stood. The power dynamic was painfully clear. Bexley's team ran the show, and Elijah was being treated like a junior intern who had stumbled into the wrong courtroom. But Elijah wasn't rattled. He knew the games. He'd watched them from the back rows of law school competitions. He knew how the wealthy played the system, and how often people like Angela never even got a voice. He wouldn't waste time on grandstanding. He'd speak when it mattered, when the weight of law could do the talking for him. Because in this courtroom, words were cheap, but truth, when spoken right, could silence everything. The city was asleep when Elijah flicked on the bathroom light in his small apartment. The mirror was slightly cracked in the corner, and condensation from his late-night tea clung to the edges. He stood there, tie loosened, sleeves rolled up, his desk behind him cluttered with law books, highlighters, and empty mugs. It was already 3 a.m. His laptop sat open, the cursor blinking on a blank document titled Closing Argument Final. 12 drafts littered his floor. Long ones, poetic ones, angry ones. None of them felt right. They were either too emotional or too technical. None of them carried the precision he needed. He wasn't just trying to convince a judge. He was trying to leave no room for doubt. In a courtroom that had treated him like a footnote, he needed every word to strike with weight. He looked into the mirror, rehearsing aloud for the 12th time. "Your Honor, the evidence shows..." He stopped. "No, too soft." Again. The lease terms were... He stopped again. "No one will remember that." He sighed and rubbed his temples. Then he glanced at his phone and called the one person who had always centered him, his grandmother, Miss Ruth, the retired librarian who raised him after his parents passed. She picked up after 2 rings, voice a little raspy but alert. "Elijah, baby, you all right?" "I'm stuck," he said, slumping against the wall. "I've got all the facts, all the proof, but I keep trying to sound impressive, and none of it feels right." There was a pause on the other end. Then her soft voice came through, as steady as ever. "Elijah, don't speak to impress," she said. "Speak to be remembered." He smiled, the tension in his shoulders easing. "That's the goal. You already know what matters. Just say it plain. Say it true. That's how your granddaddy won every town hall argument he ever had." Elijah chuckled. "Yeah, and got banned from 3 of them. Worth it every time," she said. "Say what needs to be said, no more, no less." After they hung up, Elijah stood in front of the mirror one last time. He erased everything on his screen. He took a deep breath and wrote just 3 sentences. 3 lines. That's it. When he read them aloud, even in that quiet room, they felt like they echoed. This wasn't about sounding clever. It wasn't about matching the polish of a firm with 10 floors and an army of paralegals. This was about a woman who had the law on her side and a system that pretended she didn't exist. Tomorrow, Elijah would walk into that courtroom with only 3 sentences in his pocket, but each one would land like a hammer, and he wasn't afraid anymore. The courtroom was full, every bench lined with curious onlookers, reporters scribbling in notepads, and law clerks watching with detached interest. The air was thick with anticipation. This wasn't just another eviction case anymore. Whispers had spread about the young, inexperienced lawyer trying to take on one of the city's most ruthless landlords. The stakes felt larger than life. At the plaintiff's table, Mr. Bexley sat with folded arms, his confidence palpable. His attorneys, seasoned, expensive, and relentless, were in full performance mode. The lead counsel delivered a 10-minute closing argument laced with elaborate legal citations, industry terms, and persuasive posturing. It was polished, practiced, and heavy with superiority. "We have demonstrated a consistent pattern of non-payment," the lawyer said, pacing in front of the jury box. "And while the defendant may claim retaliation, there is no causal link, no verified timeline, and certainly no standing to support damages. The plaintiff was well within his legal rights to reclaim his property. No further questions. Judge Cranston nodded along, even letting a faint smile touch his face at one point. His body language was relaxed, almost signalling a foregone conclusion. He picked up his pen as if to start drafting the ruling before Elijah had even spoken. All eyes turned to Elijah as he slowly rose from his seat. He walked with quiet steadiness toward the center of the room. No theatrics, no papers in hand, just him and his voice. He paused, adjusted his tie and looked directly at the judge. Then, with clear, unwavering conviction, he said, "Evicting a single mother for reporting mold is illegal. That's retaliation. And under Section 8 to 203B, that means she keeps her home, and you owe her damages." That was it. No long speeches, no Latin phrases, just truth. The room went utterly still. Even the reporters stopped scribbling. One of Bexley's attorneys shifted uncomfortably. The rhythm of the courtroom had been broken. No one expected simplicity to be so cutting. Judge Cranston blinked, visibly taken aback. He looked down at his binder, flipping to the statute book like muscle memory. A long silence followed as he read, reread, and checked the clause Elijah had just invoked. Elijah didn't move. Angela Morris, sitting behind him, stared at the back of his head like he was some impossible dream she didn't dare believe in. Then the judge leaned back in his chair slowly. His eyes lingered on Elijah for a long moment before he spoke. "Well, I'll be damned." A long pause. "Mr. Brooks is absolutely correct." Another pause, almost in disbelief. "Case dismissed. Miss Morris may return to her home." Gasps rippled through the room. Angela covered her mouth, tears instantly welling in her eyes. Bexley slammed a hand on the table, his attorneys stunned into silence. One of them leaned over to whisper something, but the damage was done. Elijah gave a small nod of thanks, turned to Angela, and smiled. He hadn't just won a case. He'd changed the room. With 3 sentences, outside the courthouse, the grey clouds had begun to part, letting patches of sunlight warm the cold stone steps. Reporters from 3 local stations stood waiting, microphones in hand, their cameras already rolling. Word of the verdict had travelled fast. In a city where power usually won, a young, unknown lawyer had just flipped a case on its head, with nothing more than clarity, courage, and the truth. As Elijah stepped out through the grand wooden doors, the crowd erupted into questions and flashes. He blinked under the sudden brightness but didn't flinch. Angela Morris walked beside him, still stunned, her hand trembling over her heart. Her son, Malik, wheeled out beside her, holding a rolled-up piece of construction paper tight against his chest. "Elijah Brooks! Mr. Brooks!" a reporter called out, racing forward. "You just defeated one of the most powerful landlords in the city on your first solo case. What do you have to say?" Elijah looked down, hands in his pockets, then up again, his voice calm but firm. This wasn't about winning. It was about standing up when others sit down. That was all he said. That was all he needed to say. Angela broke down in tears then, overcome by everything, the fear, the fight, and the impossible relief of being heard. She turned and wrapped her arms around Elijah, who gently hugged her back. For a moment, there were no cameras, no courtrooms, no status, just gratitude. Malik rolled up beside them and handed Elijah the piece of paper. "I drew this," he said shyly. Elijah opened it slowly. Crayon lines filled the page, bright colours, shaky shapes. It showed a house with a sign that said home, a woman and child standing in front, and a man in glasses with a briefcase standing between them and a large red figure labelled bad guy. He smiled so hard it hurt. "I'll keep this forever," he said. Behind the cameras, a familiar face pushed through the crowd. Mr. Harrison, a partner at a prominent firm, one of the very same lawyers who had once rejected Elijah's internship application with a polite but firm email. "We're currently looking for candidates with more experience." He extended a hand and spoke with a respectful nod. "Elijah, we'd like to talk to you about a position, associate level, perhaps even higher. What you did today was masterful." Elijah shook his hand, but didn't answer right away. His eyes drifted toward Angela, now holding Malik's hand as they prepared to return home. No press, no awards, just peace. That was the win. He turned back to Mr. Harrison and smiled gently. "Thank you, but I think I'll start my own firm for people who can't afford experience." There was a silence, then applause, soft at first, then growing, from law students watching from the sidewalk, from other tenants, even from a few court clerks lingering near the door. In a world built to silence the unheard, Elijah had chosen to listen. And now others were starting to hear too. Months had passed since the courtroom victory, but its ripple effect was only growing. On the corner of a once-forgotten block, nestled between a laundromat and a boarded-up cafe, a new sign had gone up. The Brooks Justice Center. Free legal aid for the people. Inside, the center buzzed with quiet energy. The walls were still unfinished, and the furniture mismatched and donated, but the heart of the place pulsed strong. A narrow hallway led to 3 small rooms, one for intake, one for consultations, and one stacked high with books, forms, and open laptops. Elijah sat at a desk made from an old door laid across 2 filing cabinets. Around him, law students from nearby universities took notes, answered phones, and helped clients fill out paperwork. Every week, more volunteers showed up, some bringing their own chairs, others just offering their time and hands. Word had spread. Here was a place where people who couldn't afford to be heard could finally speak. Angela Morris now wore a name tag that read Volunteer Coordinator. She came in 4 days a week after her cleaning shifts, organising forms, brewing coffee, and sitting beside women who reminded her too much of herself. "Bring your eviction notice," she'd say to nervous mothers in the waiting room. "We'll take it from there." Malik sometimes came too, wheeling around the centre in his chair, helping file papers alphabetically. He called the office the house that justice built. One Thursday afternoon, while Elijah was reviewing a tenant harassment case with a student intern, the front door creaked open and a familiar silhouette stepped through. Judge Cranston, dressed in plain clothes, hat in hand, his presence surprisingly quiet. The room stilled. Elijah stood, unsure how to greet the man who had once mocked his inexperience and dismissed his objections with a flick of the gavel. Cranston looked around the small office, taking in the signs of life, the bulletin board of photos, the hand-drawn Know Your Rights posters, the book stacks, the smell of burnt coffee. Then he spoke, voice low but sincere. "I misjudged you, son. I saw a boy trying to play lawyer. But that day in court, you reminded me what justice looks like." Elijah didn't say anything at first. The words felt like a strange kind of closure, one he hadn't expected or needed, but still meant something. Cranston stepped forward and set a box on the desk. Inside were 4 thick, leather-bound volumes, old but pristine. "Thought your shelves could use something weighty," the judge said. "Those are from my personal collection. Used them for over 30 years. They should live where they're needed now." Elijah ran his hand over the covers. One was bookmarked with a faded yellow ribbon. "Thank you," he said quietly. Before leaving, Judge Cranston looked at the wall behind Elijah's desk, where a single framed quote hung, written in marker on the back of a manila folder. "You don't need to say much, just speak with truth." The judge nodded once more, then walked out the door. Outside, the city moved on. But inside the Brooks Justice Center, something bigger had taken root. A movement born not of credentials, but of courage, and the seeds were still spreading. 10 years had passed, but the courtroom hadn't changed much. The same wooden benches lined the gallery, the same gavel echoed off the same stone walls. Judges came and went, but the rituals, the rising, the objections, the verdicts remained. What had changed was who now stood within them. From the last row of the gallery, Elijah Brooks, now greyer at the temples and sharper in the eyes, sat quietly, watching. His name had become known in legal circles, not because he climbed the ranks of big firms, but because he built something no one else had, a people's law movement. Community legal hubs modelled after his original centre had sprung up in 4 cities. His writings were now studied in legal clinics. Yet he'd stayed humble, teaching part-time and mentoring students who reminded him of himself. Today, one of those students was standing at the front of the courtroom, Ava Daniels, a young black woman in her first year as a public defender. She was nervous. Elijah could see it in the way she shifted her weight from foot to foot, and the way her hands trembled slightly as she opened her folder. But she stood tall. Her voice, though small at first, grew with each word. She was defending a single father wrongfully fined and nearly evicted from city housing due to a clerical error. The odds were stacked against her, just like they once had been against Elijah. She laid out her argument with careful clarity, and then, just when the court expected her to fold, she invoked a forgotten housing clause, the same rare retaliation provision Elijah had once used to change a mother's life. There was a pause in the room. Even the judge, new to the bench and notably younger than Cranston had been, raised an eyebrow, surprised. Ava nodded once, stepped back and sat down. The courtroom was still, and then came the ruling. Defense is correct. Motion granted. Fine revoked. Tenant shall retain housing without penalty. Gasps. Then quiet applause from the back. Ava let out a breath she'd been holding. She didn't cry. She didn't cheer. She simply smiled, a small victorious thing, and began collecting her things. As she reached down to pick up her worn leather briefcase, she paused and ran her hand over it gently. It had once belonged to Elijah. Years ago, he'd passed it down to her the day she graduated. She had called it old and lucky. He'd told her it carried more than books. It carried stories. As the courtroom began to empty, Ava returned to the defense table and found something she hadn't left there, a single note on plain paper, folded once, no signature. She opened it slowly and read the words written in Elijah's unmistakable handwriting. You don't need to say much, just speak with truth. She turned around quickly, searching the gallery, but Elijah was already gone. He walked down the courthouse steps as the afternoon sun painted gold across the pavement. He didn't need the spotlight. He didn't need a headline. He had seen what he came to see. His legacy wasn't in law books or plaques. It was in movement, in moments like this. A young woman standing in a courtroom with a trembling voice speaking truth the system wasn't ready for, and winning. He reached the corner and looked back once, eyes narrowing in the warm light. There would be more like her, and that was the point.